Good evening, everyone. I'm Catherine Morrison, and I'm the Adult Services Manager and Assistant Director here at the Scarborough Public Library. Thank you for tuning in tonight. We'll begin this evening with the library's land acknowledgement, read by Alan T. Paul, member of the Maliseet Nation and a library trustee.
The Scarborough Public Library acknowledges that it is located in the traditional homeland, past and present, of tribes in the Wabanaki Confederacy. We recognize and honor the current tribes who comprise the Confederacy: the Penobscot, the Passamaquoddy, the Maliseets, and the Micmac, who have stewarded this land throughout the generations. We acknowledge the Owaskoag people who once lived in what is now Scarborough. We respect the traditional values of these tribes and support their efforts for land and water protection and restoration. In offering this land acknowledgement, we affirm Indigenous sovereignty, history, and experiences.
Thank you. This is the 8th year the library has partnered with the Camden Conference to present a series of programs leading up to the conference, which this year will be held February 25th through 27th. We are grateful to the organization's continued financial support, which allows us to purchase materials related to each year's conference theme. A list of recommended books and films can be found on our Camden Conference page. The video recording of our first program in the series, which was on Brexit, has been posted on our Camden Conference page and on our YouTube channel. The final program in this series will take place on Thursday, February 10th at 6:30 on Zoom. Susanna Hancock will discuss Paris at 6, Environmental Divides and Climate Unions in Europe. If you haven't already signed up, you may register on our events page. Before I introduce this evening's speaker, we'll hear from Lenore Rapkin, who will provide information on how you can take part in this year's conference. Lenore is a member of the library's Board of Trustees and part of the Camden Conference's Southern Maine Initiative Group.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another of the several programs that the Scarborough Public Library is pleased to present each year in connection with the Camden Conference. This program is part of a community outreach program sponsored by the conference, and the programs presented here at the library are tailored to deal with subjects relevant to the subject of the upcoming conference, which this year is Europe, Challenges at Home and Abroad. The dates of this year's conference are Friday, February 25th through the 27th. And although originally scheduled to be an in-person event, will be entirely online once again this year. Please check details at www.camdenconference.org. I don't want to keep you too long, as I'm sure you're anxious to hear tonight's speaker, but I did want to give you a little bit of background on the conference itself. Founded in 1987 as a nonprofit, nonpartisan educational organization focusing on international affairs, its mission is to foster informed discourse on world issues. It has presented an annual conference every February since 1988, and today draws upwards of 1,000 attendees each year. Speakers come from around the world to share their expertise and perspectives on the subject at hand. This evening's speaker will give you a taste of what one can expect at the conference. So please think of attending a future conference. You won't be disappointed. Now back to Catherine to introduce this evening's speaker.
Thanks, Lenore. We are very pleased to welcome Dr. James Richter to speak with us this evening on the topic of the memory wars of Central and Eastern Europe. Professor Richter received his PhD from the University of California at Berkeley and has been a professor of politics at Bates College since 1987. Specializing in US and Soviet foreign policy during the Cold War, he has also always been interested in global politics, and particularly the politics of Russia and the other countries of Central and Eastern Europe. His current research focuses on the politics of memory, and that is his topic for this evening. So I'll turn it over to you, Jim. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, very much. And thanks to the Scarborough Library for inviting me. I'm really pleased to be able to do this. And thank you all for coming. I'm going to share, my background here is a cafe in Central Europe, in the small town in the Czech Republic, just so if you're asking questions, you will see that that woman will not move her arm throughout the whole time we're speaking here. But I want to go and share my screen quickly, and then we'll begin. So the topic is the memory wars in Central and Eastern Europe. I think it's probably tensions, except for the last part when we talk about Ukraine. And basically, I'm going to be looking at three central narratives in Europe and the various tensions that exist between them. And the first question I'm going to ask and answer, I hope, is the question about why is memory so important? And I think my answer is that it kind of illuminates the political tectonics in a society or in any kind of social unit, in this case, the continent of Europe. It shows sort of what's going on beneath the surface. It tends to move relatively slowly, except when it moves very quickly. And usually when it moves very quickly, it can be kind of unsettling. So public memory, I'm going to argue, is the foundation and the articulation of collective identity. It provides a guide to who we are, what actions are appropriate to people like us, and how we relate to others. The interpretation of the past then has a huge impact on collective decision-making on foreign policy or domestic policy. It kind of creates a framework through which everybody sort of evaluates the situation, evaluates the options open to them, and also evaluates sort of which options might be better. On the other hand, the collective identities in any sort of collective, even a family, if you've talked about, the family memories of the past, you will find that brothers and sisters and stuff often disagree with each other. So collective identities and public memories are never monolithic, nor are they straightforward. They are often contradictory and often contested. And because they are so important, and because they are also so contradictory and contested, the definition of the past is often a political hot potato. And I don't need to convince you, we can see that in the United States. That's obviously the monument of Robert E. Lee in Virginia some years ago. This is a more recent picture. It's since been taken down, but after the Black Lives Matter demonstration come protest, you can see that it's covered with graffiti, and then of course it was removed. So in the United States, we understand why memory can be so important. So I want to start, so I'm going to be offering three narratives. One is sort of the Western European Union, and then look at sort of the new countries that have entered into the European Union since 2004, and then look at some of those that are still left out, primarily Russia. And I want to start with this map of what the European Union looked like right at 1992, shortly after the end of the Cold War. If you look at those, you will find that it is much smaller than the more recent one in 2022 on the right-hand side. You will also see, if you look carefully, the one on the left, 1992, virtually all of the members there are also members of NATO, except for Ireland. But everybody else is a member of NATO. If you look on the left, there are members who are not, there are more states that are not members of NATO. Britain, of course, has left. but it's also much bigger. It covers much more of the continent. And so I think, so that's something we want to talk about today. I want to start there then with Europe. Now, when you talk about the European Union, they've been talking since the Cold War, but talking about a common European identity. They have long had a project for deepening integration. Mostly before the end of the Cold War, they talked about the United States of Europe, but most of the actual practical stuff was mostly economic. And so in the 1980s, they started on a real project to unify the market, which was going to take place as a result of the Maastricht Treaty in 1992. The Cold War clearly ended in 1989. Now, as NATO members, they had a clear sense of what they needed to do. What their identity was. They were for democracy, opposing what was going on in the other part of Europe. Once that other part of Europe disappeared or changed, they had a question about how would they redefine the democratic mission after the end of the Cold War. And what they came up with was this notion that sort of a negative foundational mission. They said there had been and this was before the two world wars. Europe was away, European Union was away, there would be no more war. That was always part of it. In addition, so the two world wars would say we can't repeat that. And you also had a new interest in human rights, that Europe would be a normative power. It would be leading the world and sort of thinking about how to do international politics. And for that, this was also about the time that the history of the Holocaust was becoming very important. Schindler's List was done in 1993. Other things had been happening beforehand. And so the Holocaust became sort of a negative foundational narrative. We have to unify for one reason, to make sure that the Holocaust never happened again. And so they built sort of a house of European history to try to create this single memory that would unite Europe. And just from the mission statement of the House of European History, which is in Brussels, they argue that the generation of people who experienced the tragedies of the 20th century and went on to build the European communities is disappearing. So clearly the idea is we are trying to create this memory so that we can continue. That is somewhat different from the memory in Eastern Europe. So when Eastern Europe emerged from the Cold War, the first thing they had to do is really define what their national identity is. For countries like Slovakia or Moldova, this was the first time they were ever a state. For countries like Estonia, Latvia, the Czechoslovakia, it was also the first time, at least in hundreds of years, that they were an independent state. So they had to figure out who they are and what they would be and what kind of a country they were going to be, what kind of a nation they were going to be. And their first decision is to reject communism and Soviet domination. So you see a picture of a statue of a Soviet general being removed in the city of Prague, which happened about 2 years ago. So they were going to reject that. They were going to say, instead, they were going to return to Europe. And they really made an effort to become part of NATO, to be part of the European European Union, partly for reasons of security. They were still looking to Russia, to their east, partly because of the hope that they were going to be able to benefit economically from the trade, the investment, and also the subsidies that were going to come from the European Union. At the same time, so for many years, they were doing everything they could to become part of the European club. And especially after they got in, they started thinking about their own identity. Some of the European demands with regard to abortion and human rights didn't sit well necessarily with some of the attitudes in the Eastern Europe. And there was also some resentment against EU demands on political and cultural issues. And part of the resentment, they'd always looked like the older EU states were looking down at the new ones and saying, well, we have to teach you what's going on. And you kind of see that in that cartoon, which is actually from Western Europe. But the EU, the existing EU, is all dressed in modern wear. And then, you know, you've got all the Eastern new members who are all in these quaint little costumes from the last century. And I think that attitude was very much something that affected the European Union, I mean, the Eastern European countries. There also were tensions in the narratives. So as the East tried to create their own identity, they had to create their own narrative, and the Western narrative really didn't make sense to them in some ways. For example, in the West, World War I memory is really of a pointless slaughter. It's really about people were dying for what reason? There was no good reason. Nothing good came about it. For Czechoslovakia, for Poland, for the Baltic states, it was about liberation. They all became independent, some independent again in 2018. Some had not been independent before. So World War I is more ambiguous in these Eastern European countries than elsewhere. Also, World War II is often seen as the good war in the West. We beat the Nazis, we heralded into this whole new era of prosperity. For Eastern Europe, World War II was not necessarily a good war. It was a war of dual occupation, and it was horrible during the war when they were occupied primarily by the Nazis. And for many of them, as they remember, it didn't get a whole lot better under the communist rule, and that lasted 40 years. So that was their aspect. Also, the thing about the narratives, as they were redefining their national identity, they didn't have a lot of past. They didn't want to bring in the communist past. That was unacceptable. So some of them only had the period between the wars. The problem with the period between the wars, there were more authoritarian leaders there in almost all the countries except for Czechoslovakia. So, of a model. And here you have a picture of the Hungarian Miklos Horthy, who was a very ultra-conservative authoritarian leader in Hungary, and who the current regime is trying to prop up as an example of a great past. And also the Holocaust was particularly difficult for some Eastern European countries. I mean, as someone called the Holocaust, a memory of the Holocaust, a memorial, was seen as an entrance ticket into the EU. There was nothing explicit, but it was clear that the expectations is you had to face up to the Holocaust memory. And this was difficult because under Soviet domination, Eastern Europeans didn't get much of the Holocaust memory. It was not an issue. The Soviet narrative sort of blended the fate of Jews into the other victims of fascism. If you went to the Babi Yar monument in Kiev, it was a gully, a gorge where I think about 20,000 people were murdered. Most of them were Jews. Some were other kinds of dissidents of some sort by the Nazis. The Soviets just called it victims of fascism, with the idea that these were fighters against Nazism in support of the Soviet Union, where in fact, some of them supported the Soviet Union, some of them didn't. But that was the narrative they had. And also the communist regime said, well, you don't have anything to worry about the past because you had a revolution. The capitalists who led fascism are no longer in charge. The proletarians are in charge. So you have nothing to be guilty about. So that was the narrative that they got for 40 years. And the Western narrative was then potentially a threat to nation building. First of all, in some countries, many countries, the Jews were not necessarily seen as part of the nation. So in Poland, everybody talks even today about there were Poles and there were Jews. instead of saying, well, there were Polish Jews and there were Catholic Jews. So that was very, so when they talked about what is the Polish memory, they were talking about ethnic Poles, primarily Catholic. Second, the Holocaust memory really competes with their own victim narrative. So in Poland, or they said, we were victims of the Stalinism, we were victims of Soviet rule. And the Holocaust said, well, we weren't the only victims. And so there's been struggle with the Western Europeans on that issue. They've come to an agreement, sort of, that, both the Holocaust and Stalinism was bad, but bad in their different ways. Third, it also potentially, not only does it compete with their victim narrative, but it might actually contradict part of it. Because in each of these countries, where in many of them were more Jews than in the West, there were also quite a few collaborators in almost all of them. And so that makes collaboration an issue. So they're not no longer just the victims, they might be perpetrators as well. And that's also true in France to some extent, but France can get away with it more because it didn't actually happen on their territory. And fourth, it was just seen as another imposition from the West. And so they say, well, we have our own issues, let's deal with that. So that's the second one. Now you have the third one, and that is the Russian narrative under Putin. And I'm talking about the Putin narrative because that's prominent today. In the 1990s, there was a different narrative going around which was much more self-critical of the Soviet period, even somewhat critical of the Soviet World War II experience, but mostly blaming Stalin. But Putin comes in 2000, and slowly but surely he's promoting a different narrative. And this narrative comes from his idea that the 1990s shows what happens to Russia when you have a weak state, and that is chaos and anarchy. And so even before he became president, he wrote this thing in a Russian newspaper, and part of that was said the following thing: a strong state is not an anomaly for Russian citizens, not something they have to struggle with, but on the contrary, it is a source and a guarantor of order, the initiator and prime moving force in any transition. And that really has been a key motif in Putin's reign for all the 22 years. He is interested in a strong state, returning to what he called the power vertical, the vertical of power. Only then can Russia fend off its enemies. Only then can Russia blossom as a strong state in Europe. And you've also seen in especially the last 10 years, a discrete rehabilitation of historical tyrants, Stalin and Ivan the Terrible. Ivan the Terrible, less important. Stalin, crucial. Because there's still a lot of discussion about Stalin. So Putin will recognize that repressions happened. They will say repressions happened, it was terrible, it was awful, many people suffered, many people were killed. He doesn't always mention Stalin's name, it's always in the passive voice. People were killed, people were repressed, isn't that a shame? Or isn't that horrible? And we have to remember it. So Stalin's name is kind of there. On the other hand, the big memory that Putin is going to, which I'm going to talk about, is World War II, or what they call the Great Patriotic War. This is the moment of triumph for Russia. And Stalin, in many Russians' ideas, is still given credit for that victory, especially the industrialization that happened before. So the Great Patriotic War is key to Putin's public rhetoric these days. Even when they recently condemned some people who had been supporting Navalny, they said they were repressing, they accused them of sort of damaging the memory of Russia in World War II. And there's been a law now that makes sort of lying about what the Soviets did or saying bad things about what the Soviets did in their march towards the West, sort of a crime in some way. But to understand, this is really important for not only Putin, but for many Russians as well. World War II represents an existential struggle for the survival of the nation and for survival of many of the people in the nation. Many people were killed. It was indeed an enormous struggle. And the Russian people, many people say this is the one time that all the people, regardless of class, regardless of some ethnicities, were united against the opposition behind the state. And Putin especially emphasizes behind the state. The Holocaust was part of that struggle. I mean, part of the evilness of fascism, but they don't set it apart. Again, they were anti-fascists who were killed, and that's the key. The other key is that the Soviets agree, and I think with some justification, that they played the key role in defeating the Nazis, actually complete justification. They were the key role in defeating the Nazis. At any time, even in the Battle of the Bulge, there were 3 times as many Germans fighting on the Eastern Front as fighting on the Western Front. They, you know, the Eastern Front was where the war in Europe was lost and won. They also, therefore, always say that what they did in Eastern Europe was liberated, whereas the Eastern Europeans say, no, this was another occupation. The Soviets say, we liberated you from the Nazi yoke. And finally, or another thing they say is that the West actually contributed less than they should have to the European war, including the United States. They should have invaded Europe a year earlier. They should have taken more risks, because the Soviet Union was fighting for its life at this time. And more than that, they also say, and now if you look at the official histories in the US and everything, they seek to undermine, they underappreciate the role of the Soviet Union, which I think is also to some extent justified. Finally, in recent years in particular, Putin has been talking about the Yalta division of Europe into spheres of influence as something that was justified because the Russians liberated Eastern Europe, but also necessary for the continued stability of Europe. So he praises the Yalta agreement as something that created a stable Europe that was without war for so many years. Finally, we get to Ukraine as sort of between the Russian narrative and the Eastern narrative, with moments of both. So Ukraine, here is a map you see by the colors. You see the dominant languages in each of the areas. In the West, you have where it's yellow. That is where Ukraine was dominant. However, actually, if you look carefully, so right here is where Kiev is. But if you look in the cities and in Kiev, most of the time, and certainly among the educated classes, people spoke Russian all the time. And even today, it's very easy to speak Russian in Kiev, and nobody will raise an eyebrow. And nobody really cares that much. So the yellow in the Western portion, you see this black line. That was the part that had been part of Poland between the wars, that had not been, and so it didn't suffer through the first part of Stalinism. And this blue area, part of the blue area, had never even been part of Russia. It had been part of Austro-Hungary. In this area, you have where most of the Ukrainian nationalism has begun, at least. I think it has spread throughout. And here, Ukrainian has often and always been used as sort of the daily language, even in the main capital city of Lviv. So that's important. And then of course the blue is where it is mostly Russian. This is the industrial area. This is the area that is now occupied by Russian, dissident forces or Russian supported forces, whatever you want to call them. And these areas that are pink, and that's Crimea, of course, which has been annexed. I'm sorry, I pressed the wrong thing. and this is Crimea, and the pink is like where it's bilingual, it's mostly Russian. So the city of Kharkov is here, and it's well, it says slightly more Ukrainians here. In the cities, again, it's definitely more Russian. So Kharkov is seen as a center for Russian speakers in some way. Look at it again. So you can see there's this division. There are a lot of Russian speakers, and there were people who actually identified as Russian, and so they have. So there has always been this division there, and sometimes the division is overplayed in the West. I actually, and we'll talk about that. But I do remember one time I took a group of students, and there was two women who were roommates. One was from Slovakia, so the Eastern Europe. The other one was from Donetsk, which is right about here, and in the blue. And she spoke Russian as her first language. She called herself Ukrainian. And they went to the House of Terror in Budapest, which is sort of a shrine to anti-Soviet, somewhat right-wing discussion. So there's a small bit about how bad the Nazis were, one room, and then there's like 6 rooms about how terrible the Russians were, the Soviets were. And the Ukrainian woman asks the Slovakian, says, wow, this is strange. I've always thought of the Russians as these great liberators, and here they're being acted like they're as the enemy. What do you think? And the Slovakian said, well, actually, that's what we're taught as well, that you know, the Russians were the enemy. So that sort of brought it out sort of at a very individual level. So the Russian narrative about Ukraine is, as Putin said in 2008, Ukraine is not a real country. Ukraine speaks a language that is very much like Russian. It is different, but it could be seen as a dialect. So it might not be as different as, say, Bavarian German and High German. It's about the same difference, I suspect. It was always called Little Russia. Ukraine, the word means on the margin, suggesting it was on the margin of something else. In the 19th century, the Russian Empire tried to assimilate Ukrainians as Russians. They also have the same historic foundation myth in Kievan Rus. Before it was always seen as Russian. Vladimir the Great, who was the Kievan ruler, converted the Slavs, the Eastern Slavs, to Orthodoxy in 988. Both countries now claim Kiev as their origin. So you have, and they both have, and just a bit about the timing, these are 2 monuments to Vladimir the Great, who did the conversion. This one was built in 1853 in Kiev under the Russian Empire. So the Russian Empire thought that they could do it there and they would still make a claim on it. Since 2014, I guess they felt they no longer had a claim. And so they, in Moscow, they had another monument built in 2017 to Vladimir the Great. And so, you know, so there's a system that, in fact, Russia is beginning to get worried that they have to claim the Kievan Rus for itself. Also, some Russians actually, intellectuals, especially, you know, supporters of Putin, are beginning to say that actually Russia should cite its beginning with the Muscovy regime, which happened after the departure of the Mongols, rather than with Kievan Rus. And the Ukrainians, of course, insist that Kievan Rus was the foundation of Kiev. There's no question in their mind. Another thing about Ukraine and Russia, of course, is that there was a lot of movement between the two countries under the Soviet period. There's a lot of familial ties still. There are a lot of people who have relatives in the other side. There are a lot of linguistic ties. There's a huge amount of economic ties. A lot of the military industry of the Soviet Union was done in Donetsk and Lugansk, which is where Luhansk, if you're doing the Ukrainian, which is where the occupation is going on right now. So there's a lot of reasons why Russia would be interested in that area. So the Ukrainian narratives, I'm going to start with the nationalist narrative. This, I think, has been mostly a minority narrative, and for sometimes quite a minority, but it has been a vocal minority. It is prevalent and certainly had its origins primarily in the West, as the Soviet Union was collapsing. They have expressed a desire since that time for Ukrainian independence, which has been pretty consistent and pretty vehement. If you go to Lviv, you find that the heroes are those people in World War I who tried to, during the Civil War and the Russian Civil War, tried to declare an independent Ukraine. Also, to some extent, as we'll talk about, those people who tried to declare an independent Ukraine during World War II. Like the Eastern Europeans, they wanted to distance themselves from the Soviet experience. One of the ways they did that is they promoted the Holodomor, the collectivization, which created a famine, which killed anywhere between 3 to 6, maybe 8 Ukrainians from starvation. They started promoting that as a genocide, that the Stalin was deliberately trying to kill Ukrainians. It is clear that, and the evidence is kind of ambiguous. It is clear Stalin knew that the peasants in Ukraine were dying, and as he did that, he actually made the strictures even worse, knowing then that more would die. Whether he was specifically targeting the Ukrainians is another question. Although the Holodomor was also created, I think it could be argued as a counterpoint to the Holocaust memory, both as a way to say, well, we have a genocide of our own, but also that it takes some of the issues away from how some Ukrainians acted during the Nazi occupation, which comes to my next point. In the West, so here you have a statue of here's the Holodomor monument in Kiev. This is a monument to Stepan Bandera in Lviv, which was created relatively recently. Stepan Bandera was a Ukrainian nationalist. He promoted violence. He was ousted. He was in, I think, in Poland. Well, it was all part of Poland, but he was in Krakow as the war started. He was, when Poland was divided, he went to the German side where he was safer. He cooperated with the Nazis in preparing for the invasion of Russia in 1941. So he originally sided with Hitler. His idea was that once they got there, they would make him the leader of an independent Ukraine. They didn't do that. Instead, they sent him to a concentration camp where he spent the rest of the war. His members of his group, though, continued to act, and they continued to act mostly independently. They were fighting both sides to some extent. However, it was clear they were more on the side of the Germans. And they participated actively in the massacre of both Jews and Poles in the west of Ukraine. So this is not necessarily seen as good. And what Putin has done ever since 2014, he has used the nationalist rhetoric of the rhetoric of the nationalists, especially the glorification of Stepan Bandera. And in fact, if in the official Soviet-Russian rhetoric right now, they don't really talk about the Ukrainian government as Ukrainian. They talk about them as Banderists. The whole idea is to raise up the memory of World War II, or to rather, since the memory is omnipresent in Russia now, rather to sort of brand Ukrainian independence fighters as these fascists who have who are anti-Soviet, anti-Russian, and are just bad people, and they are the ones who are starting the war. And so that's something that's coming up in the war too. And I just have a couple more minutes. One thing that is interesting, however, since the time when Putin sort of seized Crimea and put up the continuing conflict in Donetsk and Luhansk, there's been a shift, like a tectonic, in Ukrainian memory. So prior to 2014, actually, if you asked about the Holodomor, there was actually a poll in 2007. Most Ukrainians really didn't feel too strongly about it. And they wanted Ukrainian independence. That was clear. But they really felt a strong tie with Russia. And as they say, in 2007, if you ask them, was the Holodomor a genocide? I think it was like about 30% who said yes, maybe 30% who said no, definitely no. And the rest were kind of in the middle. They just didn't really think of it. Most, however, certainly did not see Bandera as a hero. Most Ukrainians totally accepted the Soviet narrative of, we had this horrible fight, we suffered, many of us died, but we were victorious, and we were victorious, with the Russians. So that was not a question for most people. Many Russian speakers identified as Russians, and many Ukrainians, they spoke both, they didn't care, and it wasn't that a big deal. Since 2014, there's been a shift in identity. The amount of Russian speakers is about the same. People haven't stopped speaking Russian. However, if you ask them, far larger amount now say, we are Ukrainian, even though they're Russian speakers. Even though they're Russian, ethnically Russian, they say, we are Ukrainian nationals, we are not Russians. Also, the Holodomor, the attitudes Holodomor, once divided, have become much more united. So in 2016, after the 2014 invasion, there was another poll, and this time it was seen that about 70%, as opposed to 30 or 40%, said yes, Holodomor was a genocide. So it has become a united national foundational myth of the Ukrainian nation. Attitudes towards World War II remain divided. So Stepan Bandera is still not a great hero. I would certainly not in the east of Ukraine, and even in the center of Ukraine, probably very divided. Instead, most people still talk about the war in a way that Russians would recognize and Russians would accept. They still see that it was a heroic struggle against an existential enemy that was won, and they're still proud of that. So, but what this slide shows is that Putin, in seeking to grab part of Ukraine when he thought it was slipping away, actually made things worse for Russia. So at that time, yes, I mean, there was a question about whether Ukraine should go towards the east or to be part of a partner of the European Union or part of the Russian-dominated Eurasian Economic Union. Most people wanted to be part of Europe, but not because of anything that was anti-Russian. It was because they felt that the European partnership had all sorts of accountability. What most Ukrainians really hated was corruption. And they felt that if they went in the European Eurasian, they couldn't get rid of the corruption. The corruption would still exist. If they went with the EU, there would be an outside force checking people, and that would diminish corruption. But Putin sort of overreacted, and we can talk more about this. And the result is, he's lost Ukraine even more. So that now the majority of people in Ukraine really want to separate from Russia much more. And just now, I just heard of a poll, it was actually an NPR, of Russia's leading poll taker. And he says that even in Russia now, compared to 7 years or 8 years ago, most Russians think of Ukraine now as a separate country, whereas prior to that, they were less likely to think of Ukraine as a separate country. It was still Little Russia. But the 2014 attitude by Putin has helped to separate them even further. And that's pretty much all I have to say. So I'll stop the share and I'll be very happy to take questions.
Thanks. People can start writing in their questions to the chat, and I'll ask a few questions while people are writing. When I first heard we were doing this topic, what came to my mind was reading about the new laws in Poland, talking about the Holocaust. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so that's part of, so Poland is a very interesting story because in 2001, a book came out in Polish, in Poland, which detailed how there was a city in the eastern Poland called Jedwabne, in which the half of the population that was Jewish had been massacred. And the official history had always been that massacre had been done by German soldiers. And what this author, Jan Gross, who's American, but born in Poland, half Polish, half Jewish, actually both whole Polish, but half his father was Jewish and his mother rescued his father during World War II. And he said that actually it was the Poles of the town who slaughtered the other half of the town members. And this created a big to-do, and it was a more liberal government. And the Poles really had a conversation about the Holocaust. It was very angry, and it lasted about 10 or 12 years. And so the cities, you got to get a much more willingness to deal with it. The countryside was much worse. But in 2015, a conservative populist government took control. They have made memory their single most important issue. And they are saying, among other things, they are very upset that Poland has been tarred with this anti-Semitic brush. They argue so they have been spending their rhetoric, their propaganda, if you will, talking about how many Poles saved Jews, which was also larger than any other country, but that's where most of the Jews lived. So that actually makes sense. And also created this law that said if you told lies about Poles acting against Jews, it would be criminal. So Jan Gross had been given a grant, an honor, an award from the previous Polish government, and that was taken, or it was threatened to take away. I'm not sure they actually ended up taking it away. But so Poland is really a sad story. It was a very stable, it was economically successful, it was liberal, there was discussion about all these things. And starting in 2015, it really started to crack down. And interestingly, I mean, the place where this new government, this populist government gets its support is from the rural areas, the poor areas. The cities tend to vote against him. And it also tends to be that part that had been the area that was part of the Russian Empire before World War I. In fact, there's a line which is as clear as the Mason-Dixon line as far as voting in the Electoral College in the United States. They have voted, for this the peace and the Law and Justice Party, and they're pretty much in control now. So that was sort of where that's sort of part of the Eastern rhetoric, the narrative there. And it has become the key issue. But these memory laws are not unique to Poland. There's a memory law in Russia against people who would badmouth the Soviet troops. There have been laws also in the West against people who might deny the Holocaust, although they're much more framed and within the context of a legal framework, which makes it less likely they would be abused. But certainly that's an issue that's come out.
That's someone asking about the states, the former Yugoslavian countries. Have you studied those at all?
I haven't a lot. I mean, clearly, but I have taught about them a little bit. So this is not an expertise. There has been a real problem there. First of all, you have, well, in Serbia and, you know, I think to a large extent, they've tried, there have been lots of movements in Serbia, I know, to try to talk about Srebrenica, the massacre there, in a way that opens it up to more discussion. There are people in Serbia, mostly NGOs, that are trying to bring things up to life. They can remain active. There's nothing that says they can't, as far as I know, but I'm not an expert. In Bosnia, they had a situation that, according to the law, the peace treaty, each side would get control of the education of the local of the territories they control, or when they're split, as in the Croatians and the Bosnians, the Muslim Yugoslavs, they each get control over the education of people who are in their area, and sometimes the area are within towns and stuff. So you have a situation, there are several schools that are divided, maybe the upstairs and the downstairs, or between two wings, or maybe some people come in the afternoon, some people come in the morning. And in the morning, they're taught that those Bosnian Muslims, the Bosnians, are terrible people. They caused the war. They're awful. They're not really even Bosnian Muslims. They're actually Croats in disguise. And in the other half, maybe in the afternoon, the other group of people are taught that, you know, those Croatians, they did all these massacres and atrocities. So, and they've always repressed. So that memory, the way that the treaty has worked, it's been very difficult to get a memory, you know, to do the memory so that it would become integrated in that way. So that's a shame. Also, memories of Yugoslavia are different. In Kosovo, I know they think of Tito as a great man. In Serbia, they can sort of take him or leave him. You know, there are all sorts of different ways of thinking about Yugoslavia too.
We have a question about if Russia does invade Ukraine, do you think, what do you think the effect of the Russian invasion will be on Ukrainian identity? Will most Ukrainians swing back to Russian influenced narratives, or will the appeal of the West make it hard for Russians to rule without active opposition?
So this is the big question, what Putin wants to do. I mean, I don't know what he's going to do. I think he would be, I mean, clearly there's a lot of posturing going on. And I think the fact that there's a lot of posturing may be kind of a sign that he's not going to do a full invasion, but also he has created himself in a box that he may have to get something in order to back down, and we don't know what that is yet, and he seems to be pretty intransigent. I suspect he may try to do something to consolidate his hold on those two eastern regions. He could try to do a massive invasion. I think that would be a terrible idea. I think for him, I think that a lot of people um, frustrated with the economic situation there, which has not gone well for the last 3 or 4 years, and or even 8 years. And they have they don't see an alternative to Putin now. And I think that his popularity is going down. So, and if there's a war, this won't be a short war. It'll make US and in Iraq, I think, look kind of easy. And so but I could be wrong there. I don't really know. But certainly it would be very costly. And I think it would be just, it would just make, it doesn't make sense, but that doesn't mean he won't do it. So, and will it shift? No, I think if anything, you will have, I think you will have a lot of resistance to Russian rule throughout most of Ukraine. I think that and I mean, they're trying to create civilian militias, and they're a much better outfitted army than they were 8 years ago. So I think it makes no sense for him to do an all-out invasion. But as I say, that doesn't mean he won't do it. So, but I don't think the Ukrainians, I mean, it's certainly, if he succeeds and if it's done and he can really repress it very quickly, which I doubt, but if he can, then it'll be like Poland, I guess. It will be under the Soviet Union, always, you're just holding it together through force. And the moment you remove the force, it'll dissolve. So.
Well, Kimberly Scott, who's the executive director of the Camden Conference, has written in to say that John Herbst, who's the former ambassador to Ukraine, will be among the speakers at the upcoming Camden Conference. And yesterday on NPR's Morning Edition, he said that if Russian President Vladimir Putin understands that there will be a major Western reaction to his aggression, the chances of a Russian invasion will go way down. He said the West should threaten Putin with huge sanctions and permanent basing of NATO forces right up against his border. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, the forces right up against the border. I'm not sure about right up against the border, but yes, I think you'd have to put more forces in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, which are all former parts of the Soviet Union, which would anger Putin. And yes, I think, and it depends on what kind of invasion it is. Also, you have in Russia right now this notion of hybrid war. I think that if there's just a consolidation, that might be something he's doing. He's just looking like it's going to invade, and then he'll say, but I'll accept, or I'll just do this little thing, and everybody will sort of breathe a sigh of relief. I think that major sanctions should be there, whether you go with the key one that would really isolate Russia financially, including all of the oligarchs who support Putin, would be canceling the SWIFT, their membership, or getting rid of the Russia and the SWIFT system for banking. And my question there is, the United States could do that, but the Europeans might not want the United States to do that. The Europeans are much more willing. So I think that creating a strong threat, very severe sanctions, the Europeans would go in with that. Putting troops in the Baltics, the Europeans, because the Baltics certainly would approve of that. If you're talking about something, if it's not an all-out invasion, if it's going to be something that's really devastating to Russia, you might get some blowback from France, from Germany, from Britain. Britain probably not. They're making good sound noises now. So you'd have to balance that together. How much, because Germany, of course, depends on Russia for its gas. And so that's an issue, and they don't really have alternatives right now. So the US gas can't get to there in the quantities they need. But I think there is the Nord Stream, which was going to be a pipeline that was going to go around Ukraine. That would be canceled. That would be, and there would be severe sanctions by the Europeans as well. I'm not sure that if it's something less than an all-out invasion, the Europeans would go as so far as the Americans probably would be willing to do.
You mentioned that the majority of Ukrainians since 2014 have shifted to identifying themselves as Ukrainians and therefore support Ukrainian independence from Russia. Has this majority become less right-wing in terms of rhetoric and identity?
It's become somewhat more national. I don't know. I mean, I to be honest, I don't know. What I do know is that, I mean, there's still some divisions. So if I know somebody who's doing a study in Kharkiv, which is in a Russian-speaking area, Russian-speaking city, or the second largest city in Ukraine, and she sees that if the government is going, I mean, had been going towards a more nationalist right wing, I think the Zelensky is a little bit less so in terms of the previous government did an anti-communism law, which said you had to take down everything that had to do with communism. The right wing was trying to silence people who were somewhat more to the left and less nationalistic. I think, so there's still a division there to some extent. Right now, I think it's probably more right-wing than it was as far as before 2014. But most Ukrainians, I mean, I went there a couple of years ago. I spoke only Russian because I don't speak Ukrainian. Everybody was very happy. And I asked about that. It says, no, everybody speaks Russian. So it's no big deal. That was in Kiev. So, I don't think that, I think the right wings, the power of the right wing has diminished a little bit, but I'm not an expert on that part. So I really can't say in great detail.
Well, you talked about this in answering another question, but it's says if Putin invades, what's his end game? Will he be satisfied with a small part of Ukraine, or will he take the whole country and then move on to other former Soviet states?
Yeah, I mean, well, so Putin is very unpredictable. He does tend to be a risk taker. He does tend to react to events. The Crimea thing, I'm not sure that was totally well prepared. I think that was sort of, I mean, it was obvious well prepared, but I don't think it was a reaction to what was going to be a catastrophic loss in Ukraine. It was something to pull something back from that. I don't think even if he wanted to take, I don't think he would be able to. I think Ukraine is something very large to swallow if he tries to do that. And I don't think he'll be able to. I mean, he'll beat it in terms of military, but I think the problems after that will be so great. And also the difference is, and this is very clear, right now, the Baltic states are part of NATO. And so the credibility, and so Biden or whoever is president cannot legitimately say, we will not defend you. I mean, it is possible somebody could renege on that, but the United States has never made that kind of pledge on Ukraine. And Biden has said, we will not send Americans to fight for Ukraine. And I actually think that that's a good thing too. You know, it does mean more to Russia than it does mean to the United States. And I think it's, to some extent, that was an attempt by Biden to actually say, we kind of accept your sphere of influence. We're not going to go in there. We're not going to defend it. But I think if the crisis was the Baltics, Biden or whoever is president would say, yes, we will use all the force necessary to protect that country. Whether that's believed or whether they actually do that is one thing, but the rhetoric will be there. And here Biden said, we're not going to use military force. And I think that's a good thing. I think that's one way to give Putin a way to say to back down at some point. Yeah.
We have one more question. Can
Okay.
you speak to how you think the Kazakhstan situation may affect what Putin does with Ukraine?
Wow.
Speak briefly to that.
Yeah, the Kazakhstan situation, I'm not sure it's going to be terribly related, actually. But again, who knows? The Kazakhstan actually worked pretty well for Putin. He was able to bring Russian troops, or the troops of the treaty organization, into Kazakhstan. They were in there quickly. It signaled to the elite dispute within the Kazakhstan whose side Putin was on. Soon after that, the Putin side won pretty handily, and the Russian forces left. Now the leader of Kazakhstan is beholden to Russia in a way that he wasn't before. But that is very different, and Kazakhstan is very different. And I'm not sure that he would necessarily say that one leads to another. Again, they seem very different to me. But again, Putin has the last word. He's commander-in-chief. Nobody would dare, on a question of war and peace, nobody would dare say no to him. So it's up to him. So has he gotten more confidence, or does he think I'm going to be in a position to restore the territory of the Soviet Union? Maybe he does want to do that. It's impossible to know. Maybe he wants to go down in history as the person who's restored, like Stalin did, and maybe he thinks he's sick and he has to do it quickly because he won't be around very long. Those are things that we just don't know. But the answer is that he knows. He does have the final decision. So I would suspect that they're different things in his mind as well, but I can't tell.
I guess we will leave it at that, and it will be fascinating, and hopefully Putin will back down and there won't be a war. We can hope for that. It was very interesting to hear your insights on Ukraine and the rest of Central and Eastern Europe. So thank you so much for joining us this evening. And we're hoping that everyone will come back for our final Camden Conference presentation. That is again on February 10th, Thursday at 6:30 on Zoom, and you can sign up at our event page, www.scarboroughlibrary.org. And we would hope to see you all back then. And we will have been recording this program, so you can watch it again. And we'll put some links when we edit the video. And if anyone that you know didn't get to come and hear it live, and they can see the recording in a week or so. So thank you to everyone for coming, and thank you for Professor Richter for joining us. It was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.
Good night.